The orchestral waltz was deafeningly shrill, the French champagne tasted unpleasantly lukewarm, and the rigid, polite smile pinned to Clara's face had begun to draw a dull ache across her jawline. Lord Davenport leaned in close, catching her eye for a singular absurd second, in which she thought he might actually solicit her hand for the next set. Instead, his gaze slid immediately over her shoulder toward the glittering center of the room. "Your elder sister, Miss Genevieve," he murmured, fussing with the starched folds of his neckcloth. "Does she harbor a preference for the Italian waltz?" It was the fourth time that evening. Clara was not treated as a woman. She was treated as an antechamber. To the high-born gentleman of Mayfair, the London season was not an ethereal dance of stolen glances and poetic declarations. It was a livestock auction disguised in Parisian tulle. Clara stood beside a cluster of wilting potted palms, nursing a glass of sour lemonade that tasted predominantly of crushed seeds and bitter regret. The grand ballroom of the Earl of Danbury was suffocating 200 aristocratic bodies packed tightly into an apartment designed for half that number, all radiating body heat, naked ambition, and the cloying perfume of desperate matchmaking. A few yards away, Genevieve Vance held absolute court. Genevieve was an extraordinary masterpiece of lineage and their mother's unrelenting instruction. She possessed tresses of purest spun gold eyes, the pristine shade of a summer sky, and a crystalline laugh that rang out like a silver bell. Men orbited her constantly. They fetched her fruit ices, fought for the privilege of inscribing their names upon her dance card, and fawned over every murmured syllable. Near the musicians' gallery on the opposite side of the room, her youngest sister Lydia generated an entirely different commotion. Lydia was fire to Genevieve's ice, dark-haired, audacious, perpetually laughing half an octave too loud, and resting her gloved fingertips upon a gentleman's forearm for a fraction of a second longer than propriety permitted. And then there was Clara. At 22, the unforgiving calculus of the ton had already relegated her to the periphery of spinsterhood. She had straight brown hair that stubbornly rejected the curling tongs and eyes, the unremarkable shade of river silt. She was resolutely ordinary. Tonight she wore a high-waisted gown of muted moss green, not because the shade pleased her, but because Lady Augusta had strictly decreed that Clara's attire must never clash with Genevieve's radiant peach satin or Lydia's vibrant crimson flounces. A heavy shadow fell across the carpet. "Miss Clara," a voice stammered. Clara glanced up. Lord Ravenscroft stood before her, young, visibly anxious and perspiring through his linen collar. "Lord Ravenscroft," she replied evenly. "A pleasant assembly. Indeed, splendid, quite splendid." He shifted his weight from his left, Hessian boot to his right, looked over her head, looked toward the refreshment tables, and swallowed hard. Clara sighed inwardly. She knew the script by rote, having performed this dialogue 20 times since April. She resolved to spare them both the pantomime. "Genevieve possesses no vacant sets before supper, my lord," Clara said smoothly. "However, she regularly takes her promenade in Hyde Park at 4 on Thursday afternoons, specifically along the Serpentine. She harbors an immense fondness for candied almonds." Ravenscroft blinked, his pale cheeks flushing a violent mottled rose. I beg your pardon. You approached me to gather intelligence regarding my sister Clara," replied her tone completely matter-of-fact. "I am merely expediting the transaction." "Candied almonds, my lord, but avoid the merchant on Bond Street. She finds their syrup too heavy. Procure them from Gunther's." "My deepest thanks, Miss Clara," the young lord stammered, executing a hasty, awkward bow before retreating into the crowd at a brisk pace. Clara took another slow sip of her lukewarm lemonade. She felt no active anger. Anger demanded an expenditure of energy she simply did not possess. It was merely a bone, deep, quiet weariness. She was the gatekeeper, the convenient, invisible footstool gentleman stepped upon to reach the glittering prizes of her household. "You are slumping again." Lady Augusta materialized at her elbow, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper delivered through an immaculate painted smile. "I am standing entirely upright," Mother Clara replied without turning her head. "If you were standing upright, your shoulders would not present such a broad, unladylike silhouette." Her mother countered, snapping her ivory fan shut with a sharp clack. "Did Lord Ravenscroft solicit a dance?" "No." He inquired about Genevieve. Lady Augusta let out an appreciative breath through her nose. "Acceptable. His estate yields 3,000 a year. Inadequate for Genevieve, of course, but it maintains the competitive tension among her suitors. You were polite, I trust." "Impeccably so. See that you maintain that standard." Lady Augusta scanned the ballroom, her eyes darting with the tactical coldness of a field marshal surveying a breach. "We must secure a title for Genevieve before June closes. The estate accounts are bleeding, Clara. Your brother's gaming debts at the clubs are mounting rapidly. If Genevieve fails to secure an alliance with significant wealth, the family will be ruined. And if we fall into disgrace, who will sponsor Lydia next season? And what of me?" Clara did not voice the question. The answer was long understood. Clara was the middle daughter, the plain domestic asset. Her role was not to achieve a brilliant match. Her role was to facilitate, to manage, and to fade into the background. She was destined to become the maiden aunt, residing in the drafty north wing of Genevieve's future country estate, mending linens and minding the nursery. "I require fresh air," Clara murmured quietly. "Do not wander beyond the galleries," her mother warned already, stepping away to intercept an elderly viscount and pinch some color into your cheeks. "You look like a corpse in that green silk." Clara placed her glass upon a passing footman's silver salver and turned her back on the ballroom. She moved down the long mirrored gallery, the orchestral music fading into a dull, thumping cadence. She avoided the terrace entirely. The terrace was where ambitious debutantes went to orchestrate compromises. Instead, she pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Danbury Library. The room was vast, dark, and blessedly silent, illuminated only by a single candelabra left burning upon a sprawling mahogany partner's desk. It smelled of calfskin bindings, old parchment, and cedarwood. It was absolute sanctuary. Dropping her shoulders, Clara reached up and pulled out 2 iron hairpins that had been digging into her scalp since 7 o'clock, releasing a heavy breath she felt she had been holding since stepping into the carriage. "If it is your intention to dismantle your entire ensemble, madam, I should inform you that I have not yet finished my brandy." Clara went rigid. A gentleman was seated in a deep leather wingback chair nestled in the shadowed corner of the room. His long legs were stretched out before him, crossed at the ankles. In the dim candlelight, she could not make out his features, clearly only the stark white linen of his cravat, the immaculate dark line of a broadcloth evening coat, and the rich amber glow of spirit within the crystal tumbler he cradled. Clara's heart gave a dull, tired thud. She did not shriek. She did not bolt for the corridor. She merely exhaled slowly, sliding the iron pins back into her hair. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice dry. "I assumed the library was deserted. It was until I sought refuge here. And now you have sought refuge here as well. I suppose it has become an asylum for the condemned." The gentleman took a slow draught of his spirit. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried the precise shade of cynical exhaustion that Clara recognized in her own soul. "You do not sound particularly condemned," Clara observed, taking a step back toward the open doorway. "You sound like an ungrateful guest hiding from his host." "I am hiding from the mothers," he corrected smoothly, gesturing slightly with his glass toward the gallery. "The ballroom is a perilous territory tonight. A gentleman cannot linger near the punch bowl for 5 seconds without being ambushed by an ambitious matriarch, brandishing an astonishingly dull daughter like a pike." Clara let out an involuntary sharp bark of laughter, immediately pressing her hand over her lips, startled by her own breach of decorum. The gentleman shifted in his chair, leaning forward into the warm circle of candlelight. Clara took his measure. He was not conventionally handsome in the powdered, delicate manner favored by Mayfair dandies. His jawline was severe, his dark brow heavy, and his thick black hair was brushed back carelessly, as though he had repeatedly driven his fingers through it in frustration. Faint lines of fatigue bracketed his eyes. He looked like a man who had commanded troops in the peninsula, or perhaps merely survived one London season too many. "You laugh," he remarked, a faint curiosity entering his tone. "Are you not one of the weapons being brandished in the field?" "I am the defective inventory," Clara answered frankly, resting her shoulder against the doorframe. The semi-darkness offered a rare, liberating anonymity. She felt no impulse to maintain a facade. "I am kept in the back storeroom while my sisters are displayed in the shop window." He tilted his head slightly. "They overlook you." "They look straight through me," Clara said, folding her arms over her chest. "Usually to inquire at what hour Genevieve walks the park, or what pianoforte sonatas Lydia prefers. I am essentially an informational directory bound in green silk." The gentleman stared at her, a direct, uncomfortably piercing gaze. Society gentlemen never looked at Clara. They merely glanced past her. This man studied her. "The green suits you," he murmured quietly. "It does not scream for attention. It simply exists waiting for someone with sufficient intellect to appreciate it." A strange, sudden tightness gripped Clara's chest. She forced it down instantly. "Are you a poet, sir? or merely deep into your decanter?" A corner of his mouth curved upward. "The latter, regrettably. I am entirely bankrupt of poetry." He rose from the leather chair. He was broad-shouldered and tall, far more imposing on his feet than she had anticipated. Setting his empty glass upon the desk, he added, "I ought to return before a search party is organized. If I remain missing much longer, they will assume I have fled to the continent." "May fortune favor you," Clara said, stepping aside to grant him a wide berth. "Beware, Lady Augusta Vance. She is currently patrolling the perimeter near the musicians' gallery, and she takes no prisoners." He paused directly beside her in the threshold. He smelled of rain, clean wool, and imported tobacco. "I shall keep your counsel in mind," he said, looking down at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "And you, Mr. Rectory, what will you do?" "I shall wait in the shadows until the carriages are called," Clara answered, meeting his gaze. "It is what I do with exceptional proficiency." For a moment he did not move. Perhaps he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "You are simply waiting for a man who possesses the wit to ask the correct question." He offered a polite, formal bow and stepped out into the gallery. Clara remained in the quiet library for several minutes, the faint aroma of his tobacco lingering in the air. She felt distinctly off balance, a ridiculous sensation. He was undoubtedly just a bored nobleman, amusing himself at a tedious assembly. When she finally returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The musicians had abandoned the waltz, launching into a frantic country dance. An electric, chaotic hum vibrated through the room. The second Clara approached the punch table, her mother seized her wrist, her fingernails biting through the silk gloves. "Where have you been hiding, Lady Augusta?" hissed, her face flushed with genuine frantic agitation. "In the library," Clara winced. "Mother, you are hurting my arm." "He was here," her mother gasped, ignoring her complaint entirely, gesturing with a trembling fan toward the grand entrance doors, which were swinging shut behind a tall silhouette. "He walked through the room for 20 minutes and we missed him. I was trapped in conversation with Lord Fife and Genevieve was dancing with a mere baronet." "Who was here?" Clara asked, rubbing her bruised wrist. "The Duke of Blackwood," Lydia whispered, materializing at their side, her dark eyes wide. "He only arrived in the capital yesterday. They say he is seeking a duchess to manage his northern estates. £50,000 a year, Clara. 50,000, and he owns half of Yorkshire." He walked straight through the salon, acknowledged no one, entered the library gallery and departed. Lady Augusta looked on the verge of furious tears. "The most eligible peer in the kingdom, and he slipped through our fingers." Clara looked toward the dark corridor, thinking of the broad-shouldered gentleman in the wingback chair hiding from the mothers. Her stomach gave a slow, heavy roll. "I am certain," Clara murmured quietly, "he will appear at the next assembly." It took 3 days for the Duke of Blackwood to reappear, and polite society nearly tore itself apart during the interlude. The Danbury Ball was the premier event of the month. The ballroom glittered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, its walls adorned with thousands of white roses that must have cost a small fortune. Yet no one was admiring the floral arrangements. Every gaze in the room was fixed upon the grand double staircase. Clara stood in her customary post near the perimeter wall, feeling a dull headache building behind her eyes. Tonight she wore a dark navy silk gown. Genevieve looked like an ethereal vision in white satin and seed pearls, while their mother positioned them strategically near the bottom of the stairs, a curated display of Vance beauty. Shoulders back, Genevieve, Lady Augusta instructed under her breath, "Smile with restraint. You are an earl's granddaughter, not an actress." "Lydia, cease tapping your foot." Clara folded her hands over her skirts. She had spent the last 3 days convincing herself that the gentleman in the library was not the Duke. It was a statistical impossibility, a foolish fantasy. And even if it were he, a 5-minute exchange in a dark room signified nothing. Dukes did not marry plain practical women in dark gowns. They married Genevieves. "He has arrived," Lydia squeaked. The entire ballroom fell into a terrifying collective hush. The string quartet faltered, playing several sour notes before trailing into absolute silence. Lord Benedict Sterling, Duke of Blackwood, stood at the top of the grand staircase. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. It was him. In the full brilliance of the chandeliers, he appeared even more formidable. He was attired in stark, severe black and silver evening dress, the tailored cut emphasizing his broad shoulders and the harsh patrician angles of his face. He radiated absolute, unbending authority. Tonight he did not appear bored. He appeared entirely focused. He began his descent down the marble steps. The silence was broken only by the synchronized rustle of dozens of women adjusting their posture. Reaching the ballroom floor, the crowd parted before him like water yielding to the prow of a warship. He did not look left or right. He did not pause to exchange greetings with his host. He walked with measured, deliberate strides directly toward the corner of the room, directly toward the Vance family. "He is coming here," Lady Augusta breathed, her voice trembling with manic excitement. He recognized his mistake. "He has come for Genevieve. Genevieve, bite your lips to heighten the rose." Lydia stepped behind me. Benedict halted 2 paces from their circle. Up close, the faint grey flecks in his dark eyes were unmistakable. He did not look at Genevieve. He did not acknowledge Lady Augusta's deep curtsy. His eyes locked directly onto Clara. "Miss Clara Benedict," said his deep baritone, cutting through the silence of the room. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, sinking into a mechanical curtsy. "They are playing a waltz," he stated, extending a large, white-gloved hand. "And I believe you promised me you would not spend the entire evening waiting in the shadows." Lady Augusta froze. Genevieve's fan slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the parquet floor. Clara looked at his extended hand, then up into his dark, unblinking eyes. The cynical armor she had worn for years cracked down the middle. "I believe I made no such promise, Your Grace," Clara murmured. "Then consider it a command," Benedict replied. A faint, dangerous smile touching the corner of his lips. Clara placed her gloved hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, and completely grounding. He drew her onto the center of the dance floor, leaving the entire ton in stunned, paralyzed silence. The following morning arrived with the subtlety of a cannon shot. By 9 o'clock, the Vance drawing room was engulfed in chaotic disbelief. Lady Augusta had spent the night pacing the Persian rug, clutching a bottle of smelling salts, while Genevieve sat in uncharacteristic silence, staring at her tea. When the brass door knocker sounded, Lady Augusta nearly jumped out of her skin. Higgins, the elderly butler, entered the morning room, his silver tray bearing a single calling card. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, has arrived," my Lady Higgins announced. Lady Augusta sprang to her feet, her eyes wild with ambition. "Quickly, Genevieve, go to your dressing room. Put on the lavender muslin. Lydia, upstairs." Higgins informed His Grace. "We shall be down in precisely 4 minutes. Serve him the fine sherry, the bottle we concealed from my late husband." "I beg your pardon, my Lady," Higgins said softly, not moving an inch. His eyes slid past the Countess, settling directly upon Clara. His Grace was remarkably specific. "He has requested an audience solely with Miss Clara." The room went deathly still. "That is an error," Lady Augusta managed to say, her voice cracking. "Higgins, your hearing is failing you." "My hearing remains perfectly intact, my lady," the butler replied evenly. His Grace stated, and I quote, "Please inform Miss Clara that if she does not descend within 5 minutes, I shall come up and fetch her myself, regardless of the scandal it will undoubtedly generate." Clara closed her eyes. Her pulse was hammering against her ribs. It was not a dream. It was not a cruel jest. She stood up, her chair scraping across the floorboards. She did not look at her mother or her stunned sisters. Smoothing the skirts of her plain brown day dress, she drew a deep, steadying breath. "I suppose," Clara said calmly, "I should not keep him waiting." She walked past her family down the corridor and pushed open the double doors of the drawing room. Benedict was standing by the hearth. He wore a dark charcoal riding coat, buff breeches, and tall leather boots flecked with road dust. He looked too large, too powerful for the delicate floral furnishings of the room. He turned as she entered, his dark eyes sweeping over her severe chignon, her unrouged cheeks and her plain brown gown. He did not grimace. A genuine quiet warmth touched his eyes. "Miss Clara," he said. "Your Grace." Clara remained near the door. "To what do I owe the honor of the panic you have inflicted upon my household? I came to take you for a drive." "A drive?" Clara crossed her arms. "In a carriage through the park." "In my phaeton, yes. It is an exceptionally fine morning. I am informed people engage in such diversions." "I do not engage in such diversions," she replied flatly. "I sit in the rear of drawing rooms and inform gentlemen of my sister's favorite flowers." Benedict closed the distance between them with several long strides. "I know nothing of flowers, but I know my horses are growing restless, and I have an immense desire to spend the next hour in your company. Will you accompany me, Clara, or must I endure another lecture from your mother?" He used her Christian name. It was completely improper. It sent a sharp shiver down her spine. "Let me fetch my police," she whispered. The open carriage was an exercise in pure intimidation. Glossy black lacquer perched high on bright yellow wheels, drawn by a matched pair of magnificent black geldings. Benedict handed her onto the leather seat with effortless strength. He brought no groom. They were entirely alone, elevated high above the cobblestones. As they passed through the gates of Hyde Park, the effect was instantaneous. It was the peak of the fashionable promenade. Carriages lined the gravel paths. Ladies twirled silk parasols, and the moment the Duke of Blackwood's distinctive yellow wheels appeared, every single head turned. Clara felt the weight of 100 staring eyes. It was suffocating. She shrank back against the leather squabs, hearing the whispers rise like the hum of a disturbed hornet's nest. Who is she? The Vance middle girl, the plain one. Why is he with her? Benedict guided the horses with absolute composure. They are staring, Clara said, her voice tight. Let them stare, he replied, without looking away from the path. They are wondering why the most powerful duke in England is driving through the park with a woman who resembles a governess. Benedict pulled gently on the reins, slowing the team to a walk, and turned to look at her. They are wondering, he corrected quietly, why a man who has his pick of the entire flock has chosen the only bird with the sense not to sing for her supper. Clara let out an involuntary breath. Do not romanticize me, Your Grace. I am no rebel. I am merely exhausted. Benedict. What? My name is Benedict. If we are to be the subject of Mayfair's gossip for the next decade, you may as well use it. Clara stared at his gloved hands. You are playing a dangerous game, and I do not comprehend the rules. What do you want from me? Benedict brought the carriage to a complete halt beneath the boughs of an ancient oak tree, ignoring the passing barouches. He turned fully on the box to face her. I want a partner, he said, the gravel in his voice giving way to stark, unvarnished honesty. I inherited this dukedom 3 months ago. My brother was a fool who drank himself into an early grave and left the estates in utter ruin. I spent the last 10 years in the army managing men bleeding in the mud. I know nothing of ballrooms, Clara. I despise the fawning, the flattery, the exhausting performance of it all. He leaned closer. Yesterday I watched you for 20 minutes before I approached you in that library. I watched you manage 3 different suitors, steering them toward your sisters with the tactical precision of a general. I watched your mother berate you, and I watched you absorb the cruelty without flinching, without breaking. You see the mechanics of this world. You see the rot beneath the silk. Clara swallowed hard. I see it because I was never permitted to participate in it. You are participating now, Benedict said softly. He reached out and took her gloved hand in his firm, warm grasp. I do not want a decorative doll who faints when the ledgers do not balance. I do not want a woman who requires constant flattery to survive the morning. I want someone who can stand beside me in the dark and not be afraid. Clara looked down at their joined hands. Her cynical armor urged her to pull away, to dismiss his words as madness. But looking into his weary eyes, seeing the desperate truth in his grip, she recognized her own isolation. He was not a fairy tale prince. He was an exhausted man seeking an equal. My mother will demand an exorbitant settlement, Clara whispered, testing the reality of his offer. Benedict's mouth curved into a genuine smile. I own half of Yorkshire, Clara. I believe I can afford your mother. Genevieve will weep for a week. I shall dispatch a diamond large enough to dry her tears. Clara looked up, meeting his steady gaze. The staring crowds, the whispers, the suffocating expectations of London all faded into background noise. I do not enjoy the season, Clara warned him softly. Benedict gently brushed his thumb over her knuckles. Then, Miss Clara, he said, we shall go home. The return to the Vance residence felt like a military extraction. Benedict pulled the phaeton to a halt before the townhouse. The front door swung open instantly, framing Lady Augusta like an eagle guarding its eyrie. Clara descended without waiting for assistance, her boots meeting the pavement with a solid thud. Benedict was beside her a second later, his massive frame creating a physical barricade between her and her mother. They mounted the stone steps together. Your Grace, Lady Augusta breathed, her eyes darting between Benedict's impassive face and Clara's composed features. I trust the promenade was pleasant. It was crowded, Benedict replied. Without waiting for an invitation, he guided Clara straight into the drawing room. Genevieve and Lydia were frozen in anxious silence. Leave us, Benedict commanded. He did not raise his voice, but the authority was absolute. Lydia grabbed Genevieve's arm and hurried out, closing the doors behind them. Lady Augusta remained, her chest heaving against her stays, a mixture of panic and desperate calculation swimming in her eyes. I am a man who values brevity, Lady Augusta, Benedict stated, standing in the center of the worn carpet. I intend to marry Clara. The banns will be read on Sunday, and we shall wed by special license before the month concludes. Lady Augusta opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again. Clara. You intend to marry Clara. I just said so. But Genevieve is a remarkably beautiful woman who will undoubtedly secure a husband suited to her specific ambitions, Benedict interrupted smoothly. I am not that man. I want Clara. Lady Augusta's gaze snapped to her middle daughter, not with maternal pride, but with the sharp evaluation of an appraiser who had just realized a dusty relic was solid silver. The Vance estate is heavily encumbered. Your Grace Lady Augusta stated, dropping all romantic pretense. My son's debts are substantial. If you take Clara, you take her without a dowry. Clara flinched, looking down at her hands, the familiar shame burning her cheeks. I do not require a dowry, Benedict said, his voice cold enough to freeze iron, and her sisters, Lady Augusta, pressed forward, sensing an opening. Genevieve requires a proper wardrobe. Lydia will need a sponsor next year. As our connection... Enough. Benedict took one step forward, his towering stature forcing Lady Augusta to retreat half a pace. Let us be entirely clear regarding the terms. I am marrying Clara. I am not financing your debts, your son's gaming habits, or your social ambitions. I will settle £5,000 upon your son's estate to clear his immediate obligations. I will establish a trust of £2,000 each for Genevieve and Lydia, accessible upon their marriages. Lady Augusta's eyes flared with hungry relief. It was more wealth than she had seen in a decade. However, Benedict continued, his voice like forged steel. In exchange for this capital, you will release Clara entirely. You will not write demanding funds. You will not send your son to my door. You will not trade upon my title to secure invitations where you are unwelcome. If you violate these terms, I will freeze the trusts and bankrupt your son through the courts. Do we understand one another? A heavy, absolute silence gripped the room. Lady Augusta swallowed hard, her posture stiffening. The terms are acceptable, Your Grace. Splendid. Benedict turned his back upon her, facing Clara, the coldness instantly vanishing from his eyes. Pack your trunks, Clara. We depart for Yorkshire 3 days after the ceremony. He walked out the front door, closing firmly behind him. Lady Augusta turned slowly toward Clara, shaking her head in profound bewilderment. You. Of all people, it is you. Clara stood tall. She felt no vindictive joy, only a clean, quiet resolve. Yes, Mother, Clara said evenly. It is me. The wedding was an austere, quiet ceremony in a damp Mayfair chapel. There were no floral arrangements, no choir. Genevieve stood in the back pew, weeping softly into her handkerchief. Lydia looked bored. Lady Augusta wore a look of triumphant satisfaction. Clara wore a dark charcoal travelling gown. Benedict stood in formal mourning dress. They spoke their vows in steady, low voices, signed the parish register, and within the hour were seated in an uncrested travelling coach heading north. The journey consumed 4 exhausting days. The manicured hedgerows of the south yielded to the rugged, dark terrain of the north, the skies widening under heavy grey storm clouds. They spoke little, but the quiet between them was grounded in mutual understanding. On the 4th afternoon, the carriage turned down a long, rutted drive lined with gnarled oaks. Blackwood Keep loomed from the moors like an ancient fortress. It was massive, constructed of dark, rough-hewn stone that looked wet even in the dry air. It lacked the delicate symmetry of southern estates. It was built to endure sieges and brutal winters. It looked precisely like the man sitting opposite her. The carriage halted in the central courtyard. There was no grand assembly of servants, only an elderly stooped butler holding an iron lantern against the dusk. Benedict stepped down into the biting wind and offered his hand. Clara took it, stepping onto the cobblestones. Welcome to Yorkshire, Benedict said, looking up at the dark facade with rare uncertainty. It is a bit of a grim ruin, I fear. My brother cared nothing for its upkeep. Clara looked at the weeds pushing through the stones, the loose shutter banging rhythmically against the upper masonry, the dust coating the windows. It is not a ruin, Benedict, Clara said softly. It is merely neglected. It requires a firm hand and a thorough scrubbing. Benedict looked down at her, surprise flashing in his dark eyes. Holloway, he called to the butler. This is the Duchess of Blackwood. Ensure there are fires in the master suite and whatever hot sustenance the kitchen can provide. At once, Your Grace. Welcome, Your Grace. They stepped into the cavernous entrance hall. The flagstones were freezing. Dark ancestral portraits lined the walls and the air smelled of wood smoke, damp stone and old dust. Benedict rubbed his brow, looking around the desolate space. I should have dispatched an advance party. I should have had it made ready. You are accustomed to better. I am accustomed to hiding in corners and balancing ledgers to keep the creditors at bay. Clara corrected him, letting her travelling bag drop to the stone floor with a thud. She unfastened her heavy wool cloak. tossed it aside and walked to a dust-caked mahogany table. She drew a single gloved finger across the surface, leaving a sharp, clean track. She turned back to Benedict. "You stated you required a partner. You said you did not want a woman who faints when things do not balance." "I did." Good Clara unbuttoned her gloves, tossing them onto the table. "Because tomorrow we dismiss whoever has been neglecting the housekeeping, we review the master estate ledgers, and we open every single casement in this house." Benedict stared at her. The tension drained from his broad shoulders, and a deep, genuine laugh rumbled in his chest. "You are a formidable woman, Clara. You paid for me," she reminded him with a faint smile. "You receive what you contracted for." Benedict stepped forward, cupping the side of her face with his warm, calloused palm. "I underpaid," he whispered. For the first time in her life, Clara Vance felt completely, undeniably seen. The resurrection of Blackwood Keep did not occur through miracles. It was achieved through lye soap, cracked hands, and beeswax. On their third morning, Clara dismissed the negligent housekeeper and elevated a capable, no-nonsense housemaid named Mrs. Evans to the post. Together they waged an unyielding war against a decade of filth. Rugs were beaten in the courtyard, chimneys swept and windows thrown open to the crisp moorland air. Benedict did not observe from the sidelines. He rode out at dawn, replaced the corrupt estate bailiff, inspected broken gristmills, and sat in tenant cottages listening to grievances, promising repairs he fully intended to execute. Their command center became the library. Every evening after dinner they retreated to the oak-paneled room. Benedict worked at the main desk over agricultural maps and timber yields. Clara sat at the central table surrounded by estate ledgers, black ink permanently staining her index finger. The silence between them was rich with mutual respect. "Your brother leased the timber rights in the valley for a fraction of their value," Clara announced one evening in late October, rain lashing against the casements while a massive fire roared in the grate. Benedict rubbed the back of his neck in exhaustion. "My brother had an exceptional talent for securing disastrous bargains. Can we reclaim them?" "Not this quarter," Clara replied, her finger tracing a column of figures. "We require the capital for the tenant cottage roofs before the frost. But if we divert funds from the disused hunting lodge in the spring, we can outbid the current holder by autumn." Benedict looked up the firelight, catching his sharp features. The hollow weariness from London had vanished, replaced by vital purpose. "Divert the funds," he agreed, setting his quill down. "You have been scrutinizing those numbers for 4 hours, Clara. Your eyes will cross. The numbers require balancing. They care nothing for my eyes." Benedict rose, walked around the desk, and stopped behind her chair. He placed his broad hands upon her shoulders, his thumbs working firmly into the tight knots at the base of her neck. Clara let out an involuntary sigh, letting her head rest forward, closing her eyes as the tension released beneath his touch. "You labor too hard," Benedict murmured near her ear. "I am protecting my investment, Benedict," she whispered, looking down at the ledger. "If you go bankrupt, I shall be forced to return to my mother and admit she was correct. I would sooner perish." A low laugh vibrated through his chest into her shoulders. "We are far from ruin thanks to you." He did not withdraw. His hands remained upon her shoulders, his thumbs resting near her collarbone. "I received correspondence from my London solicitor today," Benedict said quietly. "The trusts for your sisters are established. The funds for your brother's debts have been transferred. The transaction is concluded." Clara looked at the firelight dancing upon the oak table. The transaction, the word upon which their shared existence was constructed, suddenly felt hollow. "I see," she said, her voice tight. Benedict turned her chair gently, forcing her to meet his dark eyes. "I inform you of this because it means you owe them nothing. You owe me nothing. The contract is fulfilled." Clara searched his gaze. "And what happens now?" Benedict took her ink-stained hand, bringing it to his lips, pressing a kiss directly over the dark smudge on her finger. "Now," he said, "we build a life not out of obligation, but because we choose to." Winter descended upon Yorkshire, with fierce, blinding blizzards isolating Blackwood Keep from the world. Clara stood by the morning-room casement, holding a cup of hot tea, watching the wind sweep across the moors. The house was warm, the pantries stocked, and the roof secure. Holloway appeared in the doorway, bearing a silver salver. The post arrived through the drifts, "Your Grace." Upon the tray lay a thick parchment sealed with bright crimson wax, stamped with the Vance crest. Clara took the letter, waited for the butler to depart, and broke the seal. The heavy scent of rosewater wafted from the page. It contained 3 pages of frantic script. Genevieve had received a proposal from the elderly Earl of Coventry, a man 30 years her senior with vast wealth. Lydia was flirting with an impoverished ensign. The brother required another £1,000 to settle a card debt. At the bottom, Lady Augusta had written, "I trust the North is tolerable. Remind the Duke that sponsoring Lydia next season would be a fitting courtesy given our family's generosity in granting him your hand." Clara walked to the fireplace. The flames were consuming an oak log. Without a second thought, she tossed the 3 pages directly into the heart of the blaze. She watched the parchment curl turn black and erupt into orange flames, the demands and guilt dissolving into smoke up the chimney. "I was going to suggest we frame it as a reminder of our good fortune." Clara turned. Benedict stood in the doorway, his heavy riding coat dusted with snow, his dark hair damp from the storm. "It was a demand for additional funds," Clara said calmly, "and a suggestion that you sponsor Lydia." Benedict walked into the room, shedding his coat. "And what was your reply?" "My reply is currently turning to ash," she answered, nodding toward the hearth. Benedict stopped before her, looking from the fire down to her face. "You burned it." "I did. You did not calculate a compromise. You did not seek my consent to transmit a portion." "The transaction is finished," Benedict, Clara said, stepping close to him, unbothered by the cold melting on his garments. "I am no longer their ledger. I am yours." The words hung in the warm air, absolute and true. Benedict let out a ragged breath, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the clean scent of soap and lavender. "You are not a ledger, Clara," he whispered fiercely against her skin. "You are not a transaction. You are the only real thing in my life." He cupped her face in his warm hands, looking down into her hazel eyes. "When I entered that ballroom in London, I was suffocating, and then I saw you standing in the shadows, viewing the entire spectacle like a cheap parlor trick. You did not perform. You did not pretend." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, catching the firelight. "I did not come for your sisters, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a rough, sacred vow. "I came for the woman in the dark. I came for my wife." Clara reached up, resting her hands over his wrists. "Then you are an exceptionally fortunate man. Your Grace," she whispered with a brilliant smile, "because she has no intention of departing." Benedict kissed her, a deep, grounding kiss forged of winter air wood smoke, and the quiet triumph of 2 cynics who had built a kingdom out of stone. Outside, the Yorkshire blizzard battered the moors, but within the walls of Blackwood Keep, Clara was finally undeniably warm. True devotion is not cultivated in the glittering, superficial ballrooms of Mayfair. It is forged through shared labor, absolute honesty, and the courage to cast off the expectations of a hollow society. Clara and Benedict proved that when 2 pragmatic souls unite in mutual respect, they build an empire that outlasts any storm. Thank you for experiencing the complete story of Clara and Benedict. If you enjoyed this journey of grit, truth, and profound romance, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with fellow historical drama lovers. Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below, and I will see you in the next story. What a deeply moving story. Genevieve and Alistair's journey is romantic, of course, but beneath the beautiful gowns, grand houses, aristocratic titles, and slow-burning love, I think the story carries a much more meaningful message about dignity, resilience, grief, forgiveness, family, and the courage to begin again. What touched me most about Genevieve is that she was never saved by the Duke in the way we often see in romantic stories. Before Alistair ever offered her marriage protection or love, Genevieve had already learned how to stand on her own feet. She entered that library knowing that her father had essentially traded her future to settle his gambling debts. Yet she refused to collapse in front of him. She did not beg. She did not scream. She did not pretend that everything was fine either. She simply looked at the situation honestly and asked herself, "What can I do from here?" That is an incredibly powerful attitude, especially for those of us who have lived long enough to understand that life does not always give us the choices we deserve. Sometimes we are handed circumstances we never asked for. Sometimes people we trusted disappoint us. Sometimes family members make terrible decisions, and unfortunately their mistakes affect everyone around them. Sometimes we spend years giving to others and suddenly realize that we have forgotten to protect ourselves. Genevieve's father is perhaps the clearest example of what happens when a person refuses to take responsibility for his own choices. He gambled away generations of family wealth, then tried to make his daughter pay the price. He treated her as an asset rather than as a human being. And yet Genevieve refused to become bitter. That distinction is important. There is a difference between being hurt and becoming hateful. There is a difference between remembering what someone did and allowing what they did to control the rest of your life. Genevieve understood that hatred would only consume more of her energy. She could not change her father. She could not undo his gambling. She could not rewrite the past. What she could do was protect her own future. That is something I think many older people can relate to. After several decades of life, most of us have encountered at least one person who disappointed us deeply. Perhaps it was a family member. Perhaps it was a friend. Perhaps it was someone we loved and trusted for many years. And sometimes the hardest lesson is realizing that you cannot love someone into becoming a better person. You can advise them. You can forgive them. You can give them another opportunity. But eventually they must choose their own path. And when they refuse to change, protecting yourself is not cruelty. It is wisdom. Genevieve's relationship with Cecilia also touched me deeply. Cecilia was not simply a naughty child. She was a grieving little girl who had lost both of her parents and did not know how to express the enormous pain inside her. She threw things. She screamed. She destroyed furniture. She frightened governesses. But Genevieve looked beyond the behavior and recognized the grief underneath it. That is such an important lesson for all generations. Sometimes people who appear difficult are actually hurting. Sometimes the angry person is frightened. Sometimes the rude person is lonely. Sometimes the person pushing everyone away is desperately hoping that somebody will care enough to stay. Genevieve did not excuse Cecilia's destructive behavior. That is what made her approach so effective. She gave the child boundaries without humiliating her. She acknowledged the grief without allowing grief to become an excuse for cruelty. That is a beautiful balance, and perhaps that is something older generations understand particularly well. We have learned that love is not always soft. Sometimes love means saying, I understand why you are hurting, but you still cannot hurt other people. That is true with children, grandchildren, friends, and even ourselves. We can have compassion without surrendering our boundaries. We can forgive without forgetting. We can understand someone's pain without allowing them to make us their victim. I also love the way Cecilia slowly changed. She did not suddenly become cheerful simply because Genevieve arrived. Her grief remained. There were still difficult mornings. There were still tears. There were still moments when she could not find the right words. That feels much more honest than the idea that one person can magically fix another person's sadness. Real healing is usually much quieter. It happens slowly. One morning you wake up and realize you laughed again. One afternoon you discover that you went several hours without thinking about the person you lost. One day you find yourself looking forward to something, and then eventually you realize that the pain is still part of you, but it is no longer controlling every moment of your life. That is what Cecilia experienced, and perhaps many of us have experienced something similar. Grief does not necessarily disappear. We simply become stronger at carrying it. That is why I found the relationship between Genevieve and Cecilia almost as touching as the romance between Genevieve and Alistair. Then there is Alistair. At first he appears cold, distant, powerful, and almost intimidating. But beneath that exterior is another wounded person. He lost his brother. He carries guilt and trauma from the accident. He has spent years being the Duke, the protector, the decision-maker, the man everyone expects to remain strong. And yet when Cecilia is injured, we see just how fragile he really is. He freezes. He is transported back to the tragedy. He cannot act. And it is Genevieve who brings him back. That scene says something very important about strength. Strength does not mean never breaking. Strength does not mean never being frightened. Strength does not mean always knowing what to do. Sometimes strength means having the courage to admit that you are struggling and allowing another person to help you stand again. Alistair needed Genevieve just as much as Genevieve eventually needed Alistair. That is what makes their relationship meaningful. He did not simply rescue her from her father. She did not simply heal his wounds. They became stronger because they recognized the strength that already existed inside each other. And I think that is one of the most beautiful forms of companionship we can hope for as we grow older. At a certain age, we should not be looking for someone to complete us. We should look for someone who can walk beside us, someone who respects our history, someone who understands that we have scars, someone who does not laugh at the things that frighten us, someone who does not demand that we become younger, quieter, prettier, wealthier, or more convenient just to make them comfortable, someone who can sit with us in silence, someone who can laugh with us over something ridiculous, someone who will make tea when we are tired, someone who will listen when we need to talk, and perhaps most importantly, someone who will still respect us when we disagree. That is the kind of love that becomes more valuable with age. The scene with Lady Beatrice also deserves attention. Lady Beatrice believed that social position gave her the right to humiliate Genevieve. She saw wealth and pedigree as evidence of superiority, But Genevieve never fought her with screaming or insults. She simply refused to accept the definition Lady Beatrice tried to impose upon her. That is another wonderful lesson. You do not have to accept every opinion someone has about you. Someone can call you unsuccessful. Someone can say you are too old. Someone can say you are not attractive enough. Someone can say you made too many mistakes. Someone can remind you of your past. But their opinion does not become your identity simply because they say it loudly. As we get older, perhaps we become more comfortable with this truth. When we are young, we often spend enormous amounts of energy trying to be liked. We worry about what people think. We worry about whether we fit in. We worry about whether we are successful enough. We worry about whether other people approve of our choices. But eventually, if we are fortunate, we discover something liberating. Not everyone has to understand you. Not everyone has to approve of you. Not everyone has to like you. And you do not have to spend the rest of your life explaining yourself to people who have already decided to misunderstand you. Protect your peace. That is not selfish. That is maturity. I also found Genevieve's relationship with money particularly interesting. She understood that financial independence was not simply about having money in a bank account. It was about having choices. Her father had controlled her because he controlled her financial circumstances. The moment she negotiated for half of her salary to be placed in an account in her own name, she gained something much more valuable than money. She gained agency. And this is an important lesson at any age. We should never be ashamed of wanting financial security. Money is not everything, but financial responsibility gives us freedom. It allows us to make decisions without constantly fearing that someone else will control us. For older friends especially, it is wise to keep financial matters organized, understand where our money goes, avoid unnecessary debt, and be cautious about anyone who pressures us to give away savings or make financial decisions quickly. Unfortunately, not everyone who approaches an older person with a smile has good intentions. We should be generous, but we should also be careful. Kindness does not require foolishness. Trust does not mean abandoning common sense. And helping family does not mean sacrificing your entire future for someone who repeatedly refuses to help themselves. Genevieve teaches us that boundaries can be an expression of love for ourselves. And then comes the romance. I think the romance works because Alistair does not fall in love with Genevieve because she is beautiful in a ballroom. He falls in love with her character. He sees her courage. He sees her intelligence. He sees the way she protects Cecilia. He sees how she stands up to his aunt. He sees how she refuses to flatter him. He sees how she speaks honestly even when the truth is uncomfortable. In other words, he falls in love with the person she is when nobody is watching. And perhaps that is one of the most beautiful definitions of love. Anyone can admire a beautiful dress. Anyone can admire a title. Anyone can admire wealth. But the right person notices the qualities that are invisible to everyone else. They notice how you treat a waiter, how you speak to a frightened child, how you behave when you are angry, how you treat someone who cannot give you anything in return. Sometimes we need boundaries. Sometimes we need distance. Sometimes we absolutely need to walk away. But we should not allow one person's cruelty to convince us that everyone is cruel. We should not allow one failed relationship to convince us that love itself is a failure. And we should not allow the pain of yesterday to steal every possibility of happiness tomorrow. Marcus made terrible mistakes, but he changed. And Helena eventually allowed herself to believe that change was real. That does not mean she forgot what happened. Forgiveness does not require forgetting. It does not mean pretending that the wound never existed. It means deciding that the wound will no longer control the rest of your life. That is a beautiful lesson for anyone carrying an old hurt. Perhaps there is someone in your past whose name still brings a little pain. Perhaps there was a friendship that ended badly. Perhaps a marriage did not turn out the way you hoped. Perhaps someone said something cruel to you many years ago, and you still remember the exact words. If that is the case, I hope you can slowly release the burden. Not necessarily for them, for yourself. You deserve to enjoy the years ahead without constantly carrying the emotional luggage of the years behind you. And happiness in later life does not have to be complicated. It can be wonderfully ordinary. A quiet morning, sunlight through the window, a cup of tea, a favorite book, a familiar song from your youth, a walk through the garden, a phone call from an old friend, a meal shared around the table, a grandchild's laughter, a dog waiting at the door, a partner reaching for your hand, or simply sitting quietly in your favorite chair and realizing times I have survived so much and I am still here. That realization alone can be powerful. We spend so much of our younger years chasing the next achievement that we sometimes forget to appreciate the fact that we have already come so far. If you are in your 50s, 60s, 70s or beyond, please do not tell yourself that the best parts of life are behind you simply because your younger years are gone. Youth has its beauty, but age has something youth does not always possess: perspective. You know what truly matters now. You know that some problems that once felt enormous eventually disappeared. You know that some people you thought you could never live without became distant memories. You know that difficult seasons eventually change. And perhaps most importantly, you know that time is precious. So use it carefully. Spend more time with people who leave you feeling peaceful rather than exhausted. Laugh more. Complain less when you can. Forgive where forgiveness is deserved. Set boundaries where they are necessary. Say, "I love you" without embarrassment. Say thank you more often. Take photographs. Make memories. Travel if you can. Stay curious. Keep learning. Keep meeting people. Keep telling stories. And never become so old that you stop looking forward to tomorrow. The story of Helena and Marcus reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin after something has already gone terribly wrong. A broken beginning does not necessarily mean a broken ending. A mistake does not have to become your entire identity. A lonely season does not mean you will always be lonely. And a closed door does not mean there is no other door waiting to open. Marcus once told Helena that she was never his choice. In the end, his greatest realization was that love was no longer something forced upon him. He chose her freely. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of the entire story. Real love is not simply being chosen once. It is choosing one another again and again, especially when life becomes difficult. Not because everything is perfect. Not because two people never hurt each other, but because they are willing to learn to apologize, to grow, and to become better people together. For those of us who have lived long enough to know that life can be unpredictable, perhaps that is the real message worth carrying with us. Do not spend the rest of your life proving that you were right. Spend it being happy. Do not spend every remaining year counting old disappointments. Count the people who still love you. Count the mornings you are still blessed to see. Count the friendships that survived the years. Count the lessons that made you wiser. Count the ordinary moments that quietly became your favorite memories. And if someone genuinely loves you, appreciate them. If someone is hurting, be kind to them. If someone has earned your trust, don't take them for granted. And if someone repeatedly brings misery into your life, remember that protecting your peace is not selfish. At this stage of life, perhaps happiness is not about having more. Perhaps happiness is about needing less. Less approval, less drama, less resentment, less comparison, less fear, and more gratitude, more laughter, more meaningful conversations, more quiet mornings, more time with the people who matter, more courage to say what is in your heart. After all, we never truly know how many chapters remain in our own story. So let the next chapter be a good one. Let it be softer. Let it be wiser. Let it contain fewer arguments and more laughter. Let it contain fewer regrets and more gratitude. And above all, let it contain the people who make you feel that life is still worth celebrating. Because no matter how many years have passed, it is never too late to choose kindness, to choose forgiveness, to choose love, and most importantly, to choose happiness.